Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Michael Connolly from CPR Group and it is my pleasure to welcome you all along to our webinar this evening, all about constitutions. So just having a look through the chat, we've got lots of people. I've got to say that I'm a little bit jealous of Jeff, who's over on the beautiful Bay Islands on Macleay. I trust that you'll get a game of golf in as soon as it stops raining, Jeff. So good luck. And g'day, Kim. Welcome as well from over in New Zealand. So as I said in the introduction, a lot of our visitors this evening are from Queensland. So we do have quite a bit of content sandwiched in the middle of this evening's session that is particularly relevant in Queensland because we've had some legislation changes here. But the majority of what we're talking about will be relevant to everybody all around the country. So welcome, thank you very much for joining us. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of all of the land and the water where we work, where we walk, where we live, and of course, where we play. We recognise their continuing connection to land and to waters and to culture, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. And of course, I extend this respect to First Nations people attending today. So this is I was going to say this is a really exciting topic, but as I do that, you'll realise that I'm an incredible nerd, as are all of our team here at CPR Group that get to work on constitutions with community organisations of all shapes and sizes. And we really do enjoy this work because it's more than just a technical document that exists. So what I'd like to do this evening is take you through the purpose of the Constitution, what it should include, and some typical shortfalls that we see with community organisation constitutions, and then show you a pathway for how all of that can be made better. The most important thing that we always focus on when we're talking about anything to do with constitutions is that the Constitution needs to support us. It's no good if we're arbitrarily going and changing what we do just to fit in with what it says in a constitution. It may have been written longer ago than I've been alive. That's really quite possible for a lot of them. So if it's out of date, then it's actually it's not really difficult to bring it into date. There are just some steps to go through. So I'd like you to consider everything that we talk through this evening as steps. All of the problems are just steps to overcome. There's not hurdles or barriers, and it is not an insurmountable challenge to get this right. But I'd like to begin by looking at some of the problems that an out-of-date constitution can cause. So let me paint a picture for you. I'll introduce here Grumpy George. Now, Grumpy George could just as easily be Grumpy Georgina. And Grumpy Georges are typically the sorts of people who know your constitution better than you do. And they're very happy to bring a copy of the Constitution. Let's pretend this is my Constitution. They're very happy to bring a copy of the Constitution into the AGM and then sit on it right up until we get to that point of general business. And then they stand up and start thumping the table and say, this Constitution is out of date. We're acting illegal and everything's wrong, and really start to cause problems. And because you don't know the Constitution as well as they say they know the Constitution, you think, oh, well, they're yelling, so they must be right. And that's just not the case. So what I'm hoping you'll get out of this evening is an understanding of the Constitution, and that you'll see that sometimes when Grumpy George or Grumpy Georgina does get up and start thumping the table, that just because they're yelling doesn't mean they're right. And just because they think they understand the Constitution from first principles doesn't mean that they do. Legislation all around the country changes regularly. A lot of the Grumpy Georges know the Constitution as it existed, maybe in the 80s, maybe in the 1960s, but not necessarily as it needs to today. And you've only got to look not very far away at all to realise that we don't live in the same world that we did 40, 50, 60 years ago. Things have changed, and our Constitution should change to keep up. Not just keep up with the legislation, but really importantly, to keep up with best practice. What's the best way to manage a constitution? What are the best inclusions for our constitution? So as we go through this evening, you'll see over in the left-hand pane, we've got chats and questions. So as we get to the end, I'll come back and address the questions over there. So if you've got specific questions that you'd like to pose to the group, you can pop those in the questions tab, and that's where I'll focus with questions as we come back in the end. But then we'll also keep an eye on the chat as we're going through as well. So I encourage you, as we're going through, to put your thoughts in there as well. So the benefit of attending these sessions live is that we do get to create a little bit of a community as we're going on as well. But also over there, you'll notice the polls. So I'm going to start the first poll for the evening. And I'd like you to let us all know when your constitution was last updated. So you'll see the first of the multi-choice responses there is, don't know, no idea. Then was it more than 10 years ago, 6 to 10, 3 to 5, or within the last couple of years? So that I'm interested in this, and look, no idea is a great answer. So if you don't know, that's fine, because there's an easy way to find out. But if you don't know, we can have a quick look at it and say, well, actually, this is an old constitution, and it doesn't actually matter when it was written, because now we know that we're going to update it. And I'll take you through some processes for how that can happen. So here you go. We can see that nobody so far has a constitution that's 3 to 5 years old, but we've got, as life tends to do, resolve itself into a bit of a bell curve. We've got a bit of a bell curve turning up here, with almost half of you having constitutions that are 6 to 10 years old. 6 to 10 years is now fairly old. And there might be things that have changed in your operation that mean parts or all of the constitution is now out of date. Let's now jump into the next question. And I'm going to ask here, how, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being not confident at all and 5 being totally, yep, all over it. So knowing now, roughly, for those of you who do, how old your constitution is, how confident are you that it meets not only current legislation, but also, as I mentioned before, best practice? Okay. So we can see, look, these are great questions, because they give you a chance to reflect and think, actually, and look, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, if you are totally confident, and I can see that there are no 5-star ratings yet, if you are totally confident, you probably wouldn't need to be here on a webinar about how to update your constitution or how to keep it up to date. Okay, so here we go again. It's all at the lower end of the spectrum now. And that's perfectly okay. So you can see an average rating there of 2.3 means that we don't have a lot of confidence that we're absolutely right. So in a quick flyby webinar like this, we obviously can't address everything, but I'd like to point to what I think are the most important parts of a constitution and the most important things to focus on when you are starting to consider a constitution review as well. Before we do, let's consider where a constitution fits. And I'll start with this term, governance. Sometimes you might hear club governance, NFP governance, non-profit governance, however it's referred to. The word governance sometimes carries an air of enigma. What does this actually mean in relation to a not-for-profit? Okay, I understand corporate governance and board governance in the for-profit sector, but how does it apply in a not-for-profit context? So I like to look at governance rather than being a topic in itself. I consider it more as like the hub of a wheel with lots of spokes. Each of those spokes represents each area of governance or operation. And so governance, by definition, is basically the systems and processes by which an organization runs. So those systems and processes include, as one of the spokes, the constitution, but it also includes how our elections run. How well are we running our meetings? How well are we doing event management? How well are we managing insurance? How well are we doing asset management and making sure we have an asset register and an asset renewal plan? How well are we doing our budgeting? How well are we doing our cost setting? So all of the parts of our not-for-profit business are the spokes of this wheel, and the term governance basically binds them all together. The analogy gets better though, because if we could, because of the topical nature of the constitution, given that it's why we're all here tonight, let's consider the spoke of the constitution. If that's a weak spoke, then every time it needs to carry the weight of our organization, as in when that spoke is bearing the weight of the wheel of governance, it can buckle. Sometimes, if they're very old, or if they have really become out of step with our operations, then they can snap altogether. And what that means is that every time that spoke comes around and carries our weight, we get a bit of a dip and a bit of a dip, and we end up having a really bumpy ride. The importance of all of the topics that we address in these types of webinars is that the stronger we can make each of our spokes, the smoother the ride, while we are the stewards of our community organisations for the short amount of time that we are here. Let me now introduce the topic of incorporation. So for the most part, our community organisations all around Australia are incorporated, not-for-profit clubs, associations, societies, organisations of all types that typically fall into incorporated associations. It's not everyone, but it is where we're focusing this evening. Incorporation, when you look at the definition of incorporation in the various incorporations acts around the country, remembering that incorporation is state and territory based. So some of the larger organisations, which we're not as much focusing on this evening, but typically the rules are very similar. Some of the larger organisations, particularly national bodies that trade all around Australia, will be incorporated as companies. So they're incorporated under Commonwealth, the Commonwealth legislation, which is the Corporations Act. So that gives them all of the abilities to trade interstate and to have a bit more flexibility in the way that they appoint or elect their board, differences in membership structure, but they're still not for profit. They still operate really very similarly to incorporated associations, but on a national scale. For incorporated associations, they are managed by each state and territory under separate pieces of legislation. One of the good things to know, though, is that the sames are far greater than the differences. There are more similarities between each of the state and territory acts than there are differences. So an incorporated association, by definition, is a body corporate with perpetual succession. Now, if I can remember to give you definitions of what both parts of that mean, I'll come back to the with perpetual succession, but if I don't, just put a note in the chat. The first part is the body corporate. So one time when I was mentioning what a body corporate with perpetual succession means, somebody who was a younger person rocked back in his chair and he looked up at the screen and he said, "Oh, a body corporate, you mean like the old fuddy-duddies who won't let me have blow-up toys in our swimming pool?" I said, okay, that is a body corporate, but it's not what we're talking about here. Body corporate actually means that it's a legal entity in its own right. So it's separate from the members. So if we go back to the 1970s, when organisations set up, and we lived in a different world in the 1970s, I suppose we were probably less litigious. A handshake with the mayor really meant that we could have access to this ground for 99 years. We don't live in that world anymore. So in that time, before becoming incorporated, a group of people, and we'll take a sports club example, a group of people may have played Australian football. They all then started an Australian football club, but there was no club really, because it was really just a group of individuals with a common interest, that interest being Australian football. So it means that if they wanted to own an asset, for instance, so purchase a big piece of equipment, say a large mower, they would technically need to do that in the name of all of the members, because, you know, we're not really members of anything because there is no body corporate. We're just people with a common interest. They would have had to kind of go and make that purchase in the name of all of those individuals. When you look at that from the perspective of getting into trouble, so when things go off the rails and maybe legal action is brought against that club, then if there is no body corporate, it becomes those individuals that are individually liable for what went wrong in that organisation. When we establish the body corporate, we create a legal entity in its own right, which has all of the powers of an individual. So anything that I can do in my own name, I can buy things, I can sell things, I can enter into contracts like leases, I can enter into insurance policies, I can have a bank account, and really importantly, I can sue and I can be sued in my own name. By establishing an incorporated association as a body corporate with perpetual succession, that club now exists as a legal entity that can do all of those things in its own name. So if it buys a mower, it is the incorporated association's name that is on the purchase contract, not the name of all of the individuals. If the incorporated association gets into trouble, so something goes wrong and legal action is brought against that incorporated association, so long as the officers and the people involved have been acting within their duties, so acting in good faith within the law and in the best interests of their members, then it is the incorporated association itself that can have legal action brought against it. The incorporated association itself can declare bankruptcy should it not be able to satisfy all of its debts and liabilities with its retained assets. That is really, really important. But the benefits of incorporation don't stop there. I think that the main benefit of incorporation from a financial perspective is one that often just sails under the radar, but it's really important because it saves us a truckload of money every year. And that is that incorporated associations that are set up for specific purposes, for sport, for instance, are income tax exempt. So that means that when if as it hopefully should, our income exceeds our expenses, that means we run at a profit. we don't have to declare that as taxable income and then pay income tax on that money. That is a fantastic benefit. Incorporated associations, because we are by nature not-for-profit, means that we also get GST concessions. So the mandatory registration threshold for incorporated associations is double that it is for for-profit businesses. And that's been the case since the GST came in 2000. Then it was 50 for for-profits, 100 for not-for-profits. Now it's 75 for for-profits, 150 for not-for-profits. There's that legal protection for office holders that is absolutely critical. Because can you imagine what would happen if one treasurer of one incorporated association somewhere in the country was found to be personally liable for something that wasn't necessarily something that they did illegally or wrong. It was something that this body corporate did that got it into trouble, and they lost their assets or they went to jail. What do you think would happen to all of the other treasurers in all of the 99,999, whatever the figure is, of incorporated associations all around the country? That's right, they'd be off. But then the presidents and the secretaries are going to follow them. The public officers are going to follow them. And then all of our incorporated associations don't deliver the benefit that they currently do to the community. So we protect our volunteers in incorporated associations really, really strongly. And of course, another great benefit of being an incorporated not-for-profit association is our eligibility for grants. Grants rock. Grants are money that we can get to deliver projects, to deliver services, build new infrastructure, buy new equipment. And it's not money we have to pay back. This is money that councils and the state and Commonwealth government are very happy to invest in our community organisations because of the services that we provide to our members and therefore to the broader community. So wonderful benefits. The with perpetual succession part means that somewhere there is a way to replace all of the leaders in an incorporated association when those leaders choose to move on. And that is typically the election clauses in a constitution. So the election clauses provide a way for us to be replaced when we are no longer here. So the organisation will continue despite the people leading that organisation at any point choosing not to continue. So that's the with perpetual succession. So lots of great benefits in being incorporated, but like anything then, it's really important to understand that there are some rules by which we must operate to be able to receive those benefits. So those rules are, if you want to go back to first principles, are contained in each of the state and territory associations incorporation legislation. And they, as I said, differ slightly from state to state and territory to territory, but the majority of the information in them is the same. It's some of the technical aspects like, is it a public officer or a secretary that needs to report annually to the department that looks after our incorporated associations? But they are not materially different. What's important to understand, though, is that I'll give you a flyby of what I think are some of the most important bits. But just because I'm about to give you this insight doesn't absolve you of what I think is your obligation to read and understand your constitution. So before I do, though, I'd like to let you know why I've got fairly strong feelings about this. And it's literally because we have helped thousands, literally thousands of community organisations just like yours all around Australia to create and implement new constitutions. And it's not just the constitution, which is kind of the technical bit or the mechanical part that gets spat out at the end, because you read it and it's quite a mechanical sort of document. Some of it looks like legalese. It's because this document needs to be able to guide the volunteers who lead these organisations. So it's really important, and I very regularly, whether it's me, whether it's Matt, whether it's Chris, whether it's Steve, whether it's Mel, we all get on our high horse about this because it's really important that we have a constitution that supports the people. And that's where we like to think that when we work on constitutions, that's what we bring. That's the difference that we bring. So I'd like you to think of your constitution like a map. And if we think about a map being something as simple as a property map, I can draw on that map where I'd like the fence to go. And I can get a ruler and a pencil and I can literally draw the line where I'd like the fence to go. If I get that line on the map, which represents a fence, wrong, it's really easy to grab an eraser, rub it out, get my pencil and my ruler again, and do it again in the right place. Once I've built the fence, so moving from map to real world, it's much harder to move that fence. It's much harder to change the real world. So what we like to do is say, if the real world is right, if we are confident that the fence there is on the boundary line and it's in the right place, let's not move it just because some arbitrary piece of paper says it's in the wrong spot. If it's in the right spot, and we know it's in the right spot, let's change the map. And that's the benefit, and that's the ability that you've got in updating a constitution that no longer reflects real life. To continue the map analogy though, the Constitution sits right up here in terms of hierarchical documents that govern the governance of an incorporated association. It's right up the top. So it sits right up here, which means that it isn't appropriate for the Constitution to address everything. The most important things for the Constitution to address are all of the rules by which we must operate to make sure we're consistent with that state and territory legislation. So those are the most important parts. So the Constitution doesn't have to cover the minutiae of our operations. They can be covered in operational policies, they can be covered in bylaws, they can be covered in operations manuals, in all of the information that we need to run the organisation on a day-to-day basis, so long as the Constitution keeps us incorporated, because that incorporation provides all of those benefits and the legal protection. So as far as a map goes, think of the Constitution more like a globe. And when you want a more zoomed in look, like the old maps that we used to keep tucked into the seat pocket in the car, they were hard to fold up, then when we're getting down to that level, that's when we need to go looking for our bylaws, our operations manuals, our operational policies. But when you want the super, super zoomed in view, kind of like the street view, then that's your day-to-day operations, and all of that stuff should be recorded in your meeting minutes. So I will copy into the chat a little link here. Now, the reason that I'm copying and pasting this link into the chat is that as we get into the crux of this topic now, some parts of it may feel a little overwhelming. And if that's the case, that's perfectly okay. Just enjoy the ride and then you can contact us afterwards. Now, what you'll find at that link there, cprgroup.com.au/sports-governance, is a nice big button that will give you an opportunity to upload your constitution, and we're very happy to do a completely free, obligation-free assessment of your constitution. And that's because we've done literally thousands of these, it's pretty quick for us to be able to see where the issues may have arisen. And it's quite humorous almost how many times we can say, so reading this constitution, you've got this clause in here that says something here. Who were you trying to get rid of when you wrote that clause? And people often chuckle and say, oh, are we that transparent? Were you a fly on the wall when we did that? And it's just, we can see some of the unexpected, and we have seen a lot of the unexpected consequences of making a minor mistake in the Constitution. Significant consequences. And often we can fix those. So I will review early and the Constitution up there. We're very happy to have a look at it for you and let you know where we think the shortcomings may be. So let me now get into where I think the most important parts of your Constitution are. Now, of that list there, we're probably about a third of what most of your constitutions will contain. And of those, I'm only going to touch on literally a handful. So these are very important parts of a constitution, but they're not the only important parts. But for a session like this, I'd like to start with the top one there, objects. Our objects are why we exist. Because you're doing a constitution review, because you've got it there, this is the chance to see if the fence is in the same place as it is in real life. Does our constitution reflect why we exist? You'll often find that the objects in the constitution are fairly dry, fairly technical, but is there an opportunity here to make them more of a heart statement? This is what we believe, and this is why we do what we do. So yes, what we do is to provide opportunities for people of all ages and abilities to participate in a particular type of event or activity. But can you touch on, in looking at that, are you able to capture some of the emotion behind it? Some of the reasons that people get involved in your organisation and not similar organisations in other areas or other activities. So maybe people don't need to take part in your activities, but they do. So what is it that brings them? And that's the sort of thing that I love seeing captured in objects in a constitution. The next one is the powers. The powers are, as I explained before, they should be very simple. They should either link to the powers of an individual. So this organisation can do anything that an individual can do in their own association can do in its own name. Or it might say the association has all the powers conferred on incorporated associations as per the Act. Or it might say something similar to the association has all of the powers that a corporation has. And they all basically mean the same thing. Anything that I can do in my own name, our association can do in its own name. And that's very important. So that's your first trigger. If you have a look and you've got 2 or 3 pages of objects in your constitution, of powers in your constitution, there's a good chance that it is now out of date. The next one is the big one, classes of membership. Classes of membership is always the part of the review that takes the most time. And this can simply be because when you look at the classes of membership in your constitution, you see there's one. We might call them full members or ordinary members or members. But their rights and obligations aren't defined. And that's a short term. So the constitution should really who is eligible to vote. Are there some classes of membership that have limitations? So for instance, a limitation in that they are not able to vote. So junior members, for instance, anyone under the age of 18, for instance, as well as who is eligible to take on a leadership role. In the case of most of the incorporation legislation around the country, that means the management committee. Sometimes it's called an executive, sometimes it's a board, other names. It's typically the management committee. So who's eligible there? If you've got life members, can and should life members be able to vote? So in a club-by-club basis where individuals are individual voting members and they carry voting weight because of their own interest or the interest for their kids that they bring along to participate in our activities, then that's perfectly appropriate for a life member to vote. Some associations, though, that are an association where the voting members are actually other associations like smaller clubs, other regional or state association. If each of those clubs represents between 100 and 1,000 people, is it appropriate that one life member has equal voting power to up to 1,000 people? I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying now's the time to consider it. This is the time to have a look at it. And it's these questions that always mean that membership is the big one. Membership is the one that takes the most time. The next one I'd like to jump to falls into discipline, and it's about the process for potentially rejecting an application for membership or terminating somebody's membership. Now, it's my strong feeling that regardless of what legislation says, an incorporated association's constitution should allow for a detailed grievance procedure that includes up to mediation. Now, this is really important because there should be enough detail in there that actually specifies natural justice. So, if you take action against me, it's only fair that I be given a chance to A, why you're taking that action against me, and B, be given a chance to defend myself. So I strongly, very strongly believe that every constitution should include a detailed process for if we're going to take that sort of action in removing somebody from our organisation, that we have to follow a detailed process that says, let's give them a chance, so that we simply can't be accused of not affording them natural justice. But when you do it, just follow the process. It then sets the step-by-step basis. Now, the reason that I think this is one of the 5 things that I'd like to talk about is because it's often the part that gets incorporated associations into serious trouble. And by serious trouble, I mean that they have to go and defend their actions to the Supreme Court in their state or territory. Now, despite the fact that there's legal protection for us as the individuals who have taken that action, it's no fun going to court. It is no fun. And I don't think that makes one a happy volunteer. So a happy volunteer is somebody who has the ability to do meaningful work and be recognised for that, but just to enjoy the ride without having to wear something that is as uncomfortable as losing sleep in preparing for a trip to court. So have a detailed process, and then make sure that should you choose to take action, or should you be considering taking action, follow that process. And the final point for me to talk about is about the not-for-profit definition. So this is incorporated in the final point on this slide here about winding up. Not-for-profit does not mean we're not allowed to make a profit. Not-for-profit means that despite the fact that it's our members who have paid money into our incorporated association, no point at no point in operation and at no point of winding up take that money back. So even if the association closes down and there's money left over, that money can't go back to the members. It must be, so the winding up clause then needs to specify how it is distributed without letting it go to members. So that typically is another organisation whose constitution also prohibits the distribution of surplus assets among its members and who has objects, back to the top, that are the same or similar to ours. So this is what I call the self-limiting factor of not-for-profitness. It means that regardless of how entrepreneurial we are and how much money we make, the wonderful thing about all of the money that we make as volunteers in not-for-profit incorporated associations is that that money will always be invested in better things for our members. So better facilities, better equipment, better programs, better services, even better people for those organisations that are already or are going to in the future pay staff. So it's a wonderful factor. And again, it's all part of the rules that we must abide by to make sure that we can be and stay incorporated. So as I mentioned at the top, a very large majority of our visitors this evening are from Queensland. So what I thought that it would be worthwhile doing is touching on some very specific changes that have come into effect in Queensland based on the Queensland Associations Incorporation Act. So for those of us who are visiting from overseas or interstate, stay with us, because although other legislation hasn't changed in exactly the same way at exactly the same time, these are all critical clauses, but some of them are extremely critical. These are all very important clauses that it's okay to understand, and then you can consider how they apply to you as well. So let's begin with the changes that came into effect when the Associations Incorporation Act changes first came into effect in the middle of 2020. General meetings now can be held using technology. Now, guess why that one was introduced? Remember in 2020, we had this thing called COVID and people couldn't meet face-to-face anymore. So even if a constitution didn't allow general meetings using technology, now they can. Yeah. A number of organisations in 2020 also ended up going belly up. Now, as sad as that is, what was sadder is how difficult the process of shutting down an incorporated association has been for many. So despite the fact that, hey, this thing's gone, there were volunteers who are still putting in extra hours that will never recoup those hours because they're not able, all they're doing is just dealing with red tape, not adding value to their constituents. So the cancellation process became much simpler. In the same vein, management committee members were also able to appoint an administrator so that an organisation could be placed into voluntary administration rather than just falling over straight away. And on the other side of that is that for some breaches of the Act, the penalty increased significantly, with some fines in Queensland now in excess of $8,000. So these are the changes that have only just come into effect. So we're in July now. These changes came into effect in June, with the final one coming into effect in August 2022. So it's that pane over there on the left that's the most important here. The duties of office holders have now been properly aligned to those of company directors. Now, for those of you from interstate, some of your legislation already covered this and nailed it beautifully. We were backwards here in Queensland for 15 years since our last review in 2007. So it's great that we have now been brought into line. So these are the typical director's duties as you would see them in the Corporations Act, that Commonwealth legislation I mentioned earlier. So you now have a duty to disclose material personal interests. You now have a duty to exercise care and diligence. I know that you're probably saying, like, duh, shouldn't we always? And yeah, you did. And these applied under common law, but now they're actually specified. So it makes it much clearer for anyone considering taking on a leadership role in an incorporated association to make sure we're clear on what our obligations will be. We must take a good faith or the information we gain from being in a position of leadership for personal benefit. And the final one is absolutely a no-brainer. We must prevent insolvent trading. So insolvent trading means that you're trading when you are unable to pay your debts as and when they fall due. So I think that one is really important and should always have applied, and it certainly has in other states and territories. And so I've been looking up to you for 15 years. Now it's really good that we have come into line. And that's very important because we're dealing with public money. It might be our public, but we're also dealing with contracts that we may be entering with small businesses. And so to trade insolvent, to take on a contract with a small business, say a trophy company, knowing that we're unable to pay their debt, I think it's terrible, because it's not only bad for our little organisation, it's also bad for that small business. So that's a really important one, and I'm very glad to see it there. In Queensland, we no longer need a common seal. The common seal is the stamp that says the seal of, or the common seal of, our incorporated association. An administrative change is that the secretary needs to be over 18. And an important one, this is the one that's coming into effect as of August, so as of next month, is that incorporated associations in Queensland that are also charities now no longer have to report to our Office of Fair Trade. They only report to the Australian Charities and Non-Profits Commission. That's also great, and it also brings us into line with charities interstate. So there was duplicated reporting. Given that the reporting obligations to the ACNC are higher than those of our state and territory, of the typically state and territory bodies, that makes it much clearer. And the final two that are coming into effect sometime in 2023 are the declaration of remuneration and benefits paid to management committee members and senior staff. And also, as I mentioned before, that every constitution should include an internal grievance procedure, so that there is a process to follow for internal disputes before things need to get escalated to the Supreme Court. So what that means is that for those organisations in Queensland that are thinking about updating their constitution, we're kind of stuck. What do we do right now? Because we can make a choice to update things to knowing kind of what we know, particularly about the changes that haven't come into effect, but that's not in the model rules yet. So the model rules in each state and territory are a template constitution. And if you have a look over in the handouts section, you'll see that I've actually got a copy in there of it, just to pick one. And because we're talking a little bit topically about Queensland, I've included the Queensland model rules in there. But if you have a look at those model rules, you might notice that they haven't been updated materially since 2007. They haven't really even had an administrative touch-up since 2015. Now, I'm not that good at maths, but I know that 2015 was 7 years ago, and the world has changed a lot in that 7 years. So I think that it's really important that if you are considering an update to your constitution, that you think carefully about just adopting the model rules. Now, the benefit of adopting the model rules in each state and territory are that once they're up to date, we know that they will make sure that we are compliant with legislation. The downside is the map might not properly reflect our reality. It might not give us enough information so that it actually creates an easy opportunity for transition from one leadership team to the next come our AGM and our elections. So let's have a look at what everyone's options are. So now this is obviously Queensland, listen up, but this applies to everyone else just as much. So your options right now, as far as your constitution goes, is number one, you can just maintain the status quo. You don't have to update your constitution. Now, it's actually really important that I let you know this, because I know that some smaller groups and larger associations have received correspondence from, in some cases, legal practitioners saying, if you don't update your constitution, you're going to cop an $8,500 fine. It's simply not true. You don't have to update your constitution. The reason I'm confident in saying that is if your constitution becomes out of kilter with the Act, guess which takes precedence? The law. Of course, the Act will always take precedence. So that's a good thing. It means that we don't have to go and do anything. The problem here is, let me take you back to Grumpy George. The problem here is that if it becomes out of kilter, then where do we go for the right information? We may very well go to our constitution thinking it's up to date, because other people in our association haven't sat through this webinar with CPR Group, and you don't know that these changes have happened, and you don't know that the Act will take precedence, but somebody else does. Then where do we go for the information? Do we go to our constitution? Do we go to the Act? Do we go to our bylaws? Do we go to our policies? Do we go to the regulation made under the Act? So the that the regulation is the subordinate part to the Act that fills in some of the details. Incidentally, that's typically where the model rules or template constitutions reside in each state and territory. So that's the problem with the status quo. So while you can, just so that you've got clarity on where to go and knowing that the constitution that we're reading is right, that can be catalyst enough for saying, let's actually get in and give this a crack. So then we can simply adopt the model rules. But as I mentioned a moment ago, the model rules, especially in Queensland, and that's option 3, is to wait for the new ones to come out. They're not up to date at the moment. So we would still be missing all of those changes which haven't yet been incorporated, but will be incorporated once those final changes come into effect. And we know exactly what everything's going to look like. Now, we already do that because we can read the Act. So if you then want to really go into detail, you can take those model rules as a starting point, but then add in all of the things that we know. So the model rules are a good starting point because you know that you're starting from being compliant. Obviously, the updated ones are best where they are consistent with current legislation. But you can then add into those all of the other things that you need. So what is our grievance procedure? What is the process that we want to follow? Obviously, what are our objects and what are our classes of membership? Those are the sorts of things that we'd have to include anyway. But we might have some more information that we want to include in there about the composition of our board or our management committee. We want to have some more information in there about the business to be transacted at our AGM. That's where we can really make them our own. Number 4 is typically the point where a lot of groups get to. And a lot of groups get to this point, and it's typically 4 years in that we're having a conversation with them, where they say, how's your constitution, we might say. They say, oh yeah, it's good. We've established a constitution working party or a constitution subcommittee. When we probe further, I know that some of you will be chuckling now. When we probe a little bit further, then we find out that constitution subcommittee was established 4 years ago. They've had 4 meetings, and those meetings just happened to be the AGMs. Oh yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah, we've got some good ideas, and then nothing ever happens. So a DIY approach to a constitution can be a very protracted process, but it can also mean that you miss the unintended consequences. It can also mean that you miss some parts in there that have an unintended knock-on effect or unintended consequences to create internal inconsistencies within the document itself. Just look at the clauses all about the secretary. And then if you mandate the secretary be a member of the management committee, it's already creating an internal inconsistency with other parts about the secretary for if that secretary is also the public officer who is appointed, who may not even need to be a member. So that's why it can actually be the best option to outsource. And by no means do you need to outsource, but very often, while it comes at a cost, it's the path of least resistance. Where we like to think that we are different when our clients outsource to us is that, yes, we understand the Act. Yes, we understand the changes. Yes, we've done this literally, as I said, thousands of times. It's all about you. It is all about the people who need to be able to interpret this. So outsourcing a constitution review, the process that we take you through is one of learning. And it, of course, doesn't absolve you, as I said, from reading everything and understanding it. But by being involved in a review, you understand it genuinely, not just for what it says and how to apply it, which of course is critical, but why that's there in the first place. What protection do those clauses provide? And it's protection for you, because if that protection is all about the affording of natural justice, then of course that's exactly what you're going to want to follow, because it looks after you. So as I mentioned, I've got some handouts to share with you this evening. The first one is, as I said, a copy of the model rules from Queensland. But even if you are in Queensland, my suggestion is that you not use them, particularly because they're out of date. I've also included in there a one pager that does give you the detail that I presented in those few slides about the recent changes. And the final one is our Club Mentor program overview. So Club Mentor is our program that connects us to our partners. So it's kind of like a subscription basis offering, but it's really a partnership. So what it means is that when you need, so this is particularly for those of you who might be okay on the journey on your own. You may be perfectly confident in your ability to take the information that we've been through this evening, to understand your constitution and to make those changes internally. But for those of you who may want a little bit of extra support, who may want an extra shoulder to lean on through times of challenge, then that's exactly why Club Mentor was set up. Yes, it provides that go-to that go-to service. So when you've got a question, we can help answer it. But because of the nature of the program, in that it will send you reminders. So from us, you'll get a reminder of everything that you need to do to meet your legal obligations, particularly in the lead up to the AGM, which is a critical part of your constitution. It also means that after the new committee or board is elected, the first step is an induction program. And regardless of how much we all know from our history, this is a chance to make sure that what we're passing on to the new people coming in is right and is up to date. It's actually one of my favourite parts of the work that I get to do with community organisations, and not the organisations, it's the volunteers. It's the people who have the heart and the passion and the interest to run a great organisation, but they just need a bit of tweaking in understanding some of this stuff and putting it into terminology that everyone can easily understand. So I would like to now open it up to questions. I will also pop all of our contact details and the Club Mentor link into the chat as well. So are there any questions that have come up? Oh, it looks like we've got a lot of questions have already been answered as I've been through. So I'll just give you a moment to pop any information in there. Wonderful. Okay, so there's the way to contact us. If you come up with a question, if there's something that you think, oh, I wish I'd asked that during the webinar, please just send us a quick note. If you're not already subscribed to our newsletter, you'll find that on our website at cprgroup.com.au. You can find us all over social media, and we'll share with you, it'll be early next week, we'll share with you a reminder so you can have a copy of the recording from tonight's session. And I would encourage you, if you come on your own, I would really encourage you to share that with others from your organisation. Because sometimes it's just that breaking down of the myths, making sure that, and there are some questions that I love to ask to really demonstrate that we have fuzzy understandings of what our obligations actually are. And sometimes we're overcooking it. So let's make our life as easy as it can be as far as understanding and keeping our constitution up to date, understanding our incorporation obligations, because what that means is if we're not mucking around wasting time here, we are spending our time on the highest and best value topics. So Karen's asked, are you saying we should not update our constitution at the moment in Queensland? No, I'm saying that you certainly can. All I'm saying is if you are in Queensland, my suggestion is that you not use the model rules at the moment. So it's more a process of going through and doing the exploration to make sure you're including all of the changes to the Associations Incorporation Act. But if it's time to update the Constitution, then by all means, yes, Karen, certainly. And the reason is that who knows how long it's going to be. So all of the changes that are yet to take effect, to let you in on a little secret, they were all supposed to have been done already. So because COVID got in the way, and obviously all of the governments around Australia have had bigger fish to fry, that's, I think, perfectly okay. But yes, as you've said, much overdue. So, and look, you'll see a few things. I encourage you to pop it in there, and I'm very happy for us to have a look at it, and we can certainly point to that. Please talk about costs involved in changing one's constitution. Thanks, Ali. That's a good question. It is how long is a piece of string, because for incorporated associations, so we're working with a national association at the moment, and obviously the depth of consultation that needs to go in that because of the number of members all around the country who will ultimately need to vote to approve the new constitution. So that consultation program is critical. That's a much larger piece of work. But if I can give you an idea of it being a few $1,000s to get that done. If you look at having legal representation to do that, it will typically be quite a bit more expensive. And while I absolutely support the legal profession, and I've got some very, very good friends who are lawyers and some people that I respect incredibly as constitutional lawyers, what we bring by doing it through our program is the human touch, that it's all about what you do as volunteers and as people to make sure that you're able to add the best value. Are there grants available to cover the cost of doing this work? Yes, there are, Jeff, absolutely. Now, they change from time to time. I know, I think where you are, there are some council grants that can at least contribute to the costs, absolutely. And we've had plenty of success in the Redlands with those sorts of programs in making sure that we're able to assist organisations to provide the best services that they can. There are often some state grants as well. So depending on each council, and often councils have fantastic grant programs. And if it's not going to cover the full cost, at least it contributes significantly to make sure that the costs are certainly affordable. The one thing that I'd add there is always look at any investment you make in professional services, whether it's a cleaner, whether it's a consultant to help with a constitution or a strategic plan. You should always consider those as investments. And remember the term ROI. There should always be a return on that investment. And the return on the investment in the services that we provide is to make sure that you understand what's going on. It doesn't matter that we understand. It doesn't matter that Fair Trading understands when we lodge it with them. It matters that the people who have to apply that constitution day by day, that you understand. And so when you're happy and when you understand, that's when we're happy. Ali said, what are the consequences of having something in your constitution which you don't follow? For example, the costs of certain kinds of membership. Great question. The short answer is it depends, because really it depends on who knows and who they talk to. So if, for instance, you're in Queensland, say, Ali, sorry, I don't know where you are from. If you can just let me know where you're from, I'll see if I can add a bit more guidance to that. But if your state, so our Office of Fair Trading, Access Canberra, Licensing NT, Department of Consumer Affairs, if they don't have a process for dealing with any complaints that are escalated on an incorporated association not following their constitution, then for the matter to be resolved externally, it would have to typically go to the Supreme Court. So we don't want that to happen. So typically things just kind of scoot under the radar. That doesn't make it okay. So this is a great example of where the Constitution, the map, doesn't reflect reality. So what I would suggest is that the Constitution shouldn't include any fees. The fees, how fees are set, should be included. So is that the members who set the fees at a general meeting? And please don't make it that. Or is it the management committee or board who sets the fees? And if that, so that should all it be, that's all that it should say, because then the fees can be amended from time to time without having to go through the process of updating your constitution. Remembering that to update the constitution, we need a vote of a 75% majority of the eligible voting members attending a general meeting, a special general meeting or an annual general meeting, to adopt the new constitution. So there is always a time delay. Then it doesn't come into effect until it is registered with our state department. So that can be a 4 to 6 week delay, but once they've done an assessment and got back to us. So it's really important that the things that might change, and absolutely pricing needs to change regularly, shouldn't be specified in a constitution, but that there should be a process for that happening. And that's certainly something that we work through, because it's slightly different with each organisation. So for larger organisations and for organisations that have fixed costs that they know are going to stay the same, or they know that are dictated to them, then there are ways to tie our pricing to our costs, making sure that we also understand, that not-for-profit, how much. So, okay, doesn't mean we're not allowed to make a profit. It means we should make a profit, but how much should we be setting as our kind of baseline to make? But there are often cases where organisations are accused of not acting in line with their constitution. And while that is often just because of ignorance, that's not belligerent ignorance or malicious ignorance. It's just, I took this job on because I love my club and I didn't want it fall over. I didn't want to see it fall over. So I took the job on, but I didn't know that. So, while I didn't know is no excuse legally, we can fix that. So by going through a process, you can learn what you need to understand and why it's important that you understand it, and then apply that learning consistently. Great. Excellent. That's great. Thank you very much, everyone, especially for the little chunk of questions there at the end. As I said, what I'll do is I'll leave the chat running for a few minutes as well. So if there's anything that you think of, come back and pop it in the chat and we'll reply, and even if it is by email. But if there are some more questions that you come up with and you want to submit those to us, then if you can do that kind of by now or over the weekend, then we can send out the answers to those questions next week as well. As you leave this evening, you'll be invited to fill in a short questionnaire. The question in there that I'm really interested in is ideas for topics for the future. So we do have a program lined up between now and the end of the year, and that'll be dealing with succession planning. So what about when I want to leave? How do I find the people, and how do I do that handover? And also in the lead up to AGM season, how to run an AGM, how to prepare for it, what to do, and we'll provide some really practical guidance for you. So I'm interested if there are other ideas that you've got, particularly as we offer some more webinars into next year as well. But there's also our podcast, Basket Case Club. So there are some issues that we address there. It's usually a bit more honest and tongue-in-cheek with Steve, my brother, and myself, talking about what we see, but always with a solution. So always with guidance in each of those episodes. So you'll find that on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts. You'll find that on our website, and it's called Basket Case Clubs, and it is a lot of fun. And of course, I'm biased, but there are lots of people who get a good chuckle out of what we talk about, and they always roll their eyes and say, oh, that's so us. So once again, thank you very much for joining me this evening, and I look forward to catching up with you all again next time. Good evening.